Hi, everyone. I'm Ronnie. Thank you for joining our webinar today about Black Swans and contract review. A few words about us, and we will dive right in. Superlegal is a contract review solution powered by AI and expert attorneys. We help businesses accelerate contract review and negotiation and basically reduce resilience on costly outside counsel. I don't want to take up any of our time talking about Superlegal. That's not why we're here. We have a packed, interesting session planned. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Chris, Superlegal's VP of Legal Operations. Chris has over 25 years of experience as a commercial lawyer, and he's here to kind of shine a light on managing unexpected risks and strengthening contract resilience. So over to you, Chris, and thank you for educating us today.
Thank you. I apologize for bouncing around the slides as we get set up here. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful for the opportunity to address this notion of black swans. I'm going to stick to a pretty rigorous agenda. If you have questions, we'll have time at the end to address a couple. Uh, we're We're concerned about pain points in contracts, and the one we're specifically addressing today is this notion of what is a black swan. So, the notion of black swans goes back to actually ancient Rome. And the idea back then was that a black swan didn't exist. So, a black swan was like a unicorn, right? A non-existent thing. But when the Western world arrived in Australia, uh, they discovered there were black swans. So the idea of black swan changed to become an event that is seemed that seems impossible, that is deemed impossible, but actually can happen, and specifically highly improbable events that have great impact, great negative impact. So that's what a black swan event is. And we're going to be talking about, therefore, expecting the unexpected in contracts. How do you expect something that you can't expect? We'll address that. Um, some examples of black swan events in recent days is COVID-19 and tariffs. Those are things that were largely unexpected, even though we had some precedents for significant tariffs in the past and influenza. So how do these rare events affect us and how can we work around them? So the whole premise of this little training is to be proactive about these rare events and not just reactive, not waiting until the event has come and then trying to address it. So we're going to talk about various contract principles, various areas in the contract, various concerns, and how we can treat them in a way that is going to protect you. So the first thing we're going to talk about is force majeure. I don't really know the background of everybody here, so I can't say whether that's a familiar term or not. So I will assume for the moment that it is not familiar and give a brief summary of what it is and how it's traditionally worked. So traditionally, force majeure just means a superseding event. Traditionally, it means an act of God, something outside of the control of parties to a contract that impacts the ability of the parties to perform, or at least one party. So those acts of God were earthquakes, floods, wildfires, tornadoes, hurricanes, tsunamis. Those events could come without necessarily much notice. They could have devastating consequence and could prevent a party from performing. So if you were hired, say, for example, I was hired to paint somebody's house, for a wedding, and the day of the wedding, a hurricane comes through. I would be excused from my performance, and the wedding would probably be off as well. But those events can be extremely disruptive and cause either total non-performance or delayed performance. That list of things that force majeure clauses have tried to address has expanded over the years. So originally it was acts of God, and now those clauses address war or terrorism, certain government actions, labor disputes, disease, and other unforeseen events. So it's really grown. And in some cases, a party may opt out of the contract after a force majeure event if it's caused substantial enough disruption. So that is what force majeure is. It comes from the French. Force means strength or force. Majeure means major or superseding. So it's a superseding event that interferes with a contract. So force majeure clauses are typically narrowly interpreted by courts, meaning they don't uh, look at a force majeure clause and extrapolate from it. So the example we have here is COVID-19 didn't qualify as a superseding event unless disease or pandemics or government action were explicitly mentioned in the contract because COVID-19 invoked all of those. And it's traditional in a force majeure clause to have something called a catch-all at the end, right? A little safety net that says, here's the list of superseding events, of force majeure events that excuse our non-performance, but also we're going to catch everything that's outside the control of the parties. So we'll say other events beyond the control of either party. Those catch-alls, as interpreted by courts, are not really catch-alls at all. In other words, if the event isn't enumerated, courts are generally reluctant to claim force majeure happened. So that means that as somebody who's putting together a contract, you have to start thinking, how can I anticipate these events and address them in the contract before they happen? So in practice, we have learned a lot. First of all, is causation is critical, meaning the event has to directly cause the non-performance. So let's say I'm hired to paint this house for this wedding, and there's a hurricane, but for some reason I'm able to get the painting done. It's just an arm of the hurricane. It's okay. I get it done. My non-performance isn't excused if it doesn't interfere sufficiently. So causation, having a causal link between the event and your non-performance is critical. COVID-19, for example, if I had a job during COVID-19 that was totally remote, all done by Zoom or some other remote method, and COVID-19 hit and the streets are shut down and the stores are shut down and people are supposed to quarantine at home, that might not affect my performance. So I can't claim it as an excuse. I can't curl up with a good book that day and say, COVID-19 is here today, I'm not going to perform. I would be in breach of contract. Another thing that we've learned from practice is courts really look at foreseeability of an event. So some courts really want to see the event as unforeseeable, and then we get into the paradox of if it's unforeseeable, how could you possibly enumerate it, list it in a force majeure clause? Uh, but you definitely want to be as comprehensive as possible and do your best, because at least if you mention pandemic while nobody, or even disease, while nobody knew COVID-19 was coming, they would at least be protected from disease related events, right? And that would give you a leg up in court. Uh, the next one I want to talk about is tariffs. and trade policy. We saw earlier this year the Trump administration imposed a lot of significant tariffs, and we're still seeing some threats of new tariffs. For example, this past week on China, those from everybody I've talked to in the construction industry hit hard, whether directly or indirectly because of suppliers. And the impact has caused soaring material costs, supply chain disruptions. So if you're getting, say, a supplier is providing you with certain raw materials or with a prefabricated material and it didn't make it to you because they rely on a raw material that was affected by tariffs, that can really affect people. Fixed price contracts create big risk in that environment because you've priced around the cost of materials. Uh, those are mostly comments from the construction world, but in commercial contracts, the same thing applies. If you're manufacturing products, you may be directly affected by these issues. So, how do you address those things? Well, one is through a price escalation clause or price adjustment clause. So, if prices exceed a certain percent, your costs, then you can change your bid, your contract value, or trigger a discussion. You can have material specific triggers. And so here's the question. What would you have in a force majeure clause that would cover a tariff change? Are they covered under the something that says government action as an event or supply chain disruption? Yeah, probably. And so if you don't have those, you might want to add them. You might want to mention tariffs directly, but you have to be thoughtful because merely mentioning tariffs exist. It would have to be significant changes in tariff policy uh, to properly cover it. I want to get back to COVID-19 and pandemics, global health crises, because we did a little digging. Prior to COVID-19, in the decade before, we found about 500 cases, fewer than 500 cases, that actually made force majeure a major part of the case. So that invoked a force majeure provision. And none of those dealt with pandemics or national health crises. Why? Because we didn't have any in that decade. Nothing that would be that significant. But overnight, that changed. Hundreds of new cases were filed after COVID-19 hit us, trying to seek protection under force majeure clauses. And we learned some things from that. One is that most courts said if you don't mention pandemic, epidemic, or health crisis, you're not going to get relief. So general language wasn't enough, including that catch-all of any event outside our control. And so that has informed us. What do we do in this post-COVID world to address the next pandemic? And I would recommend mentioning epidemic, which is a local breakout, pandemic, which is global, quarantine, or public health emergency. That's pretty exhaustive. And I think if you add those, you're going to be pretty well protected in the event of another outbreak. It's at least as much as you can do, and you would rather have it in there than not. Remember, epidemic is regional. Epi means centered on a spot. Pandemic means across the globe. The next one I want to talk about is cyber attacks and data breaches. I've got a little history spelled out here I won't go into, but arguably the first cyber attack happened in 1834 on French telegraphs and stealing information in the telegraph system. But it really exploded in the 90s when the internet became widely used and email more widely used. And cyber attacks and data breaches are a major issue now. It's a $1.5 trillion industry. That's more than I make in a month. It's the number one global business risk, and the average cost of a data breach is about $4.5 million. So we live in a cloud world, right? Where data is stored offline and a password is used to access it. And that means somebody who can hack a password can access that data if not going through other means. So, what can you do in a contract to protect against cyber attacks or data breaches? You can specifically mention cyber attacks. Some language we've seen is cyber attacks on critical systems, internet infrastructure failures, but traditional references to acts of God are not enough. And theft and malicious damage, first of all, I don't see those a lot in force majeure clauses. Second of all, they're probably not specific enough for you to feel comfortable. I wouldn't rely solely on those. And it's a good po time to point out that I'm talking prescriptively. I'm talking about how to treat things in the future moving forward. Uh, and it's worth noting that just because it's not ideal to rely on theft or malicious damage, if that's what you have in your contract and it's currently under dispute, you can still argue it. And I've spent my career arguing things in court, and this gives me something to argue with a straight face. Also, I'm going to skip that. I'm going to move on. So, one thing to remember is that anybody claiming force majeure, in other words, they're claiming that they can't perform based on one of these crazy events happening, has the burden of proof in court. So they have to prove the who caused it and showing it, the causality in your performance. And we're going to talk about this if it's linked to a state or ideology. Uh, it may give you some protection under uh, terrorism and war issues because these are often used in conjunction with those, but we'll discuss those later. Another thing to consider is climate-related disruptions. So traditionally, as I've mentioned, force majeure was all about acts of God. So earthquakes, floods, etc. Now, the scientific consensus is leaning much more strongly toward these being man-caused, right? Human-caused. So having uh, anthropogenic origins is the word that they use. So how do we separate acts of God from acts of mankind, humankind? We see some suggestion in the scientific literature and scientific consensus that weather events are increasing in frequency and severity based on human causes. And whether you agree with that or not is not terribly relevant. The question is legally, where do you stand? And we also see in response to those events, government and regulatory efforts to change the behavior of people or to monitor behavior to try to curb the continuation of those events or minimize them. And so that is a government intervention. That is not an act of God. Uh, and force majeure clauses should anticipate environmental regulation, climate-related natural disasters, and try to plan around that as well. So it just adds to what we need to consider in a force majeure clause. The next event I'd like to discuss is insolvency or mergers and acquisitions. So a merger and an acquisition is where one company either purchases another or they blend together. But when a company is being bought or having a significant change like that, ownership change, or when it faces insolvency, you might find your counterparty doesn't exist anymore or has changed substantially. And if it's through private equity, for example, the change to the structure of your organization might totally eliminate what the counterparty currently does that is relevant to your contract. So let's say that you're in a contract with a supplier and it gets acquired by another company who then eliminates supply and you're the one relying on that supply, you've got a problem. Insolvency is another one because if somebody petitions the bankruptcy court for relief, you may find your whole contract is frozen and you may find assets being dealt with in ways that harm the performance under the contract. So often insolvency or acquisition give rise to a termination right. So you want that in your contract. Insolvency laws can freeze litigation. I was in court arguing an important case. I had witnesses lined up and it was an evidentiary hearing and I'm making my case and the judge interrupted me and said, "Hey, I just found out that this your counterparty's in bankruptcy," and opposing counsel hadn't even mentioned that. And I said, "Well, that's news to me." And she said, "Well, what are we going to do? Can we proceed with this hearing?" I said, "I can't offer a bankruptcy opinion on the spot. I'm not a bankruptcy lawyer." And she called off the hearing, and the case was frozen at that point. So you can see that insolvency can be a big deal, even in interfering with dispute resolution. So there's a big operational impact as well. Delays or disruption based on these events can really affect things. And if let's say that you're the service provider or the product supplier in a contract and you've got a sudden insolvency, you might not be able to suspend your obligations, but they also might not be able to pay. So you can face some difficulty there. That's not just an operational impact, but a financial impact. Um, and a few tips. How do you manage this? The first thing is to know who you're dealing with. So really look into your counterparty in a contract. You want to understand how deep their pockets are, how capable they are of performing, what their risks are. Then, if you're satisfied that you want to go into business with them, you want to have strong contract language, have a suspension right. I like to add a clause near the payment clause that says if the counterparty doesn't pay, we can suspend our service. And depending on which side of the contract is, you might want a suspension right, like we discussed a moment ago. Have a clear effects of termination clause, and then continue to monitor the financial health of your counterparties in various contracts, vendors, partners. Understand, have audit rights in the contract, understand how they're doing, and encourage them to be open in their dialogue. And if you're the one that can't perform, make sure that you communicate well. A lot can be solved through good communication and being ready and quick to admit a problem. Uh, there's a wise person once told me if you have to eat crow, eat it young. Nobody wants to eat a crow. They're probably a nasty bird. But if you're going to eat a young one. That means if you've made a mistake and you have to own up to it early before the consequences have escalated. Now, that goes against what a lot of attorneys say. They say don't admit anything, don't say anything, bide your time. And I'm not saying confess to things. that you think you may have done wrong. Just acknowledge the factual problem. And I have seen where sometimes clients of mine have been too quick to take responsibility only to discover that they weren't at fault. So don't be too eager that you're taking on an admission of fault that isn't your own, but also don't clam up, don't disappear. There are studies that show that, for example, doctors who make a mistake and admit it are far less likely to be sued than those who pretend they didn't make a mistake or stop communicating. And yet, most attorneys will tell you, don't admit fault, don't acknowledge fault, be quiet, don't talk. And I'm saying that that may not be in your best interests. Good relationships can eliminate significant amounts of time and money lost in litigation or arbitration or other dispute resolution processes. So next, I'm going to talk about war as a black swan event. Russia invaded Ukraine a couple of years ago now, and arguably, some maybe junior high school kid learning about that might think, oh, Russia and Ukraine have a problem. But what we know is that the effects of this invasion have been felt globally. It's disrupted global trade. Russia is one of the major oil suppliers and natural gas suppliers to Europe, and uh, Ukraine and Russia both have significant agricultural industries. And though that invasion also triggered sanctions, which caused foreign companies to exit Russia, in some cases Ukraine, and they incurred billions of dollars in gross losses. So, what are the consequences for construction I have here or commercial contracts? Supply chain disruptions. Picture that a company that's at war is a supplier of materials or widgets. You can have contract interruptions due to sanctions and counterparties being affected by those sanctions. You can be affected by government actions, trade bans, export controls, operational disruptions such as site closures, halted projects. Picture there's a steel plant in a country that is at war, and that plant is destroyed or personnel are called up. So we see labor shortages here, military mobilization, and all of a sudden that plant shuts down or significantly curtails its production. If you recall, during World War II, we had Rosie the Riveter as kind of a symbol of how the workforce was heavily depleted of men who were serving in the military, and women stepped in and filled a lot of that void to keep things going. But there was still a disruption. So we don't know where the next war is going to be. Unless you have a crystal ball, we don't know if you're dealing with foreign countries at all, you might be affected, but also domestically. That war could be on our soil or affect our manpower. So here are some force majeure considerations. The definition of war has changed over time. For example, think of Vietnam, where that was called a police action and not a war. We've got formally declared war, but we also have armed conflicts. How should you refer to these events? And I would say, as has been my theme throughout, is list as many of these things as you can think of. War, armed conflicts, um, international disputes and contentions, uh, damage to infrastructure, things like that. Just start thinking and brainstorming creatively about how you want to address those issues. I'm mindful, by the way, that you don't want a force majeure clause that's 3 pages long. So you need to be strategic in what you include. This is not an easy solution because a lot of parties will see a big insertion in a contract as untenable. So sometimes we like to pare that way down and be very strategic in what we mention in a limited list because we know that the longer the clause, the more likely the other party is going to squawk. That said, force majeure doesn't seem to be as controversial as some other clauses. You also, as I mentioned before, might want to look at price adjustment clauses, price escalation clauses. There are other parts of the contract that may be implicated. I've talked about a lot, so I'm now gonna do kind of a long wind down and leave some time for questions at the end. Uh, we're gonna end at 11, at quarter to the hour. And I want to make sure that we do have some time for any questions you have, so please come up with any. But I would like to do kind of a careful recap is what constitutes a force majeure event? Think about it and be specific. Word to the wise, you now want to include pandemic, cyber attacks, trade shifts, war. You want to still have the catch-all phrase of other events outside a party's control, but realize that doesn't do a lot. But here's what it will do. It may not add to your list if you forgot to mention anything about disease or anything about war. It may not fill a gap, a total gap. So picture a a big hole in your wall, and you might take a piece of sheetrock and approximate it and cover that hole, and then tape it and put mud on it and paint it over, and maybe it looks pretty good. Uh, that is not going to be helpful in this situation for force majeure. You don't want huge missing gaps. But let's say that you mention war, but don't mention police actions, armed conflict. At least having war is related. So that's kind of like having a crack in your wall that you fill and patch, right? Having the catch-all of anything outside the control and having at least a framework, a skeleton of events is going to be stronger. Courts are there to be persuaded. They don't have all the answers, and the more we can do to make their job easier, the better. Number two, clarify the scope of non-performance, uh, meaning does your force majeure clause allow termination of the contract or just delay? Uh, are both parties excused or only the party that is negatively affected by the non-performance of the other? Something to think about. Think about causality, that causal link. So is force majeure only in effect if it's impossible to perform work? Or a little softer, it's impracticable. That's not impractical, by the way. That's impracticable, which means it can't be put into practice. Or is it triggered when performance is merely hindered? Or address in progress work and next steps. So, what can you do prior to the disruption when you know it's coming? What dates are implicated? What notice requirements does the contract make you give? How do you mitigate harm? That's what both parties might have to mitigate the damage, which means preventing it from getting bad. So let's say, for example, that there's a leak, a pipe is leaking on property, and it's the fault of somebody who ran into your house with a car. Okay, so we've got clear fault. This person who ran into your house with a car is at fault, and your pipe is leaking. But if you can easily patch the pipe and stop the leak or turn off the water main or something like that, and you don't, you have failed to mitigate damages. Doing what you can to limit the damage is mitigation of damages. And that's the duty of a party to any type of event is you can't just sit back and watch a cascading series of events and not do anything. You need to try to do reasonable things to prevent continued damage. So your I'm going to say your second line of defense is well-drafted contracts. Your first line of defense is know who you're entering into a contract with, doing your due diligence. But really, legally, your first line of defense is a well-drafted contract. Try to think of unforeseen events. Let me start you somewhere if you feel overwhelmed by that. Forget about unforeseeable events. Think about events that you've seen in your industry that have either hurt you, hurt other people in similar companies, complaints, disruptions, problems, and start with those things. Start trying to address things like COVID-19 pandemics that you know can happen, disease related events. Uh, Supply chain disruption. First of all, have a business continuity plan that's usually outside the contract, but really think and brainstorm what happens if I need to provide countertops to a company and the materials that I need for it are disrupted. Do I have another supplier, a backup supplier? Do I have a warehouse with plenty of backup stores that will last a month, 6 months, a year, 10 years? What can I do strategically to plan for these events? If capital is the issue, how can I have loans or lines of credit or something that I can draw on? And then, you know, if you're dealing with a party and you're worried about their ability to perform in the case of a force majeure event, have good notice requirements that they need to notify you early and really do a lot of planning and thinking. Stroke your chin, brainstorm, and work that into your contracts. Business continuity and resilience. Try to perform as much as you can. Don't walk away. Try to communicate well. Have disaster recovery protocols. Cooperate. I have found that a lot of parties are actually very understanding of these things and willing to work, and they may talk tough because they're afraid of losing the benefit of the contract. But when there's a pandemic, people know that's happened. They're often willing to discuss and work out something. So don't be shy about opening those discussions. I'm not going to go through these real world case studies, but you can look them up. Hershey's chocolate, KFC, their UK supply chain collapse. You can look up what happened in those events, but a lack of planning and rolling out things too quickly caused significant damage to their operations. So here are some proactive risk management techniques: risk identification, supplier evaluation, strong contract terms, ongoing monitoring, audits, whatever. Those are things I hinted at during the discussion. And you also have tools. There are tech tools, compliance and regulatory tools, contingency planning, communication. So, in sum, by being thoughtful, proactive, anticipating, expecting the unexpected, we can really do a lot to build resilience in a company to meet the challenges that it will see in the future. I'm now opening up to any questions.
Thanks, Chris. I'll share a few questions that we got throughout and would love to hear from you. So, one question was about how important is it to distinguish between temporary suspension of obligations versus full termination in these force majeure clauses?
Yeah, you want to consider it's going to be very business specific for you. It's a good question. Is your business one that with a force majeure event you cannot perform at all? Or is it one where you can perform, just not all of your functions? Does it have a cascading effect for let's say that you're a subcontractor for subs under you, or if you're, I don't know, a supplier and you're a manufacturer and you rely on suppliers, think strategically. There's not a one size fits all answer, but I would think it's wise to consider both short term delay oriented risks and full termination risks. That's usually the counterparty right to terminate after, say, 60 days if you haven't performed that long. So it gives them an out. And that to me seems generally fair.
Hmm. Okay, great. Another one, what's the best way to handle work already performed and payments already made when a disruptive event occurs in the middle of a contract?
Yeah, so if somebody has done work and not been paid for it, or somebody else has paid for work and it hasn't been done, I think is the question. That's a great question because progress payments or in installment payments are a good way of managing the flow of work and payments, not paying all up front and relating payments to performance, but also not having payment lag after performance too far, uh, because insolvency can happen quickly. Look, the warning signs are there for a long time, but it can happen quickly because somebody might not be communicating with you. And so making sure your payment model takes into account these types of events. So it's going to depend a lot factually on your business.
Yep. Yep. Okay. I'll shoot over one more. How can we use data from past contracts to predict and maybe help mitigate high impact risks?
Well, that's excellent. If you have good access to your data, you can look at performance problems in the past, disputes that have arisen out of past contracts, and look for patterns in that behavior. That would be very wise to do. It's the extra effort that may make all the difference down the road. Let's say it this way in conclusion. There are unforeseen black swan events that none of us have thought of, that we haven't discussed, that will happen in the future. Something we don't understand. Maybe nanobots or zombies attack your business, right? We don't know what's coming. And word to the wise, today's alarmist, paranoid person is tomorrow's prophet, right? What's considered crazy today, tomorrow is all of a sudden just smart planning ahead. I can think of some good examples of that. I don't have time for it, but plan, think, brainstorm, be thoughtful, be cautious, and look, there's no perfect contract. Give yourself a break too. Do your best, but don't stay up all night thinking about the unthinkable. Just do your best, use the tips you have, the experience you have, and this should serve you well.
One last one because this was just submitted. You had stated events must directly cause the inability to perform. How would you handle the shipping disruption ripple effect caused by the Suez Canal blockage?
Yeah, so Suez Canal, that's a key shipping lane, right? So it's a great question. I would say if you've got supply chain disruption and shipping is affected, even if it's multiple steps down the chain, you have an excellent argument in court that that directly impacted you. What would be an indirect impact is if you had shipping lane problems and it affected one material you needed, but you're claiming it for all your performance on other materials as an excuse. That would be unconnected, not causally linked. But I think you have an excellent argument and should feel content if you've mentioned supply chain disruptions, shipping, manpower disruptions, things like that, and even international conflict. Uh, a lot of shipping has been impacted by pirates and by Houthi rebels and by other causes. And so think of how you can characterize those and put it in your contract.
Great stuff, Chris. Well, we're going to wrap it up to make sure you guys are all on time for your next meeting today. So thank you so much for joining us today. Would really love for you to learn more about Superlegal. Go ahead and visit our website, and we'd love to chat offline. Thanks, everyone, and especially thanks to you, Chris.
My pleasure. Thank you all for attending. Hope it was useful and feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye bye.